There's a town in New England with a pond on the north end and a dusty old dead end where my Marie lives. And at night when the stars glow, I stand by the window and wonder what more could this life ever bring. There's a boat by...
Hello everyone, welcome back to Memories. And let's get right on with the story. If you remember last time, we had entered the year 1939, and now I'm going to continue with 39. So here we go. I hope you're enjoying it. Okay. Before I introduce you to some of our neighbors back in the spring 39, I decided that I would finish the third grade at Grove Street School with a teacher I was quite fond of. She was Miss Miriam Kelly. She is still alive, though quite infirm, and I understand afflicted with Parkinson's disease. You probably know her as Miriam McCourt, a former selectman of Spencer. Though it was a little walk from Grove Street School home, I used to come home for lunch. We used to get 1 hour from 12 noon until 1 p.m. The route from the school down a small gravel road off Grove Street, into some woods past Angel Sawmill, down to the rear of Clevin's, jumped the brook and back of the Sugden block, and up Pleasant Street, up Prouty Street to our home on High Street. Let's take a walk up High Street on the west side from Main Street. The first house was a duplex inhabited on one side by Frank and Anna Maher. They owned a food market in a building destroyed by fire on the site of where Cumberland Farm store is now located. On the other side of the duplex lived Jack Mulcahy and his wife May, Anna Maher's brother and sister-in-law. Jack Mulcahy was the proprietor of Jack's Lunch, a diner that was hitched to the end of the building where Cormier's Jewelers is now situated. The next house going up the hill was the Sagendoff mansion. Arthur and Martha Sagendoff owned Altacrest Farms. Mr. and Mrs. Stan Kenwood and their grown son Norman lived in the cottage in the back of the mansion. Stan Kenwood doubled as both chauffeur and butler for the Sagendoffs. In the next house lived the Dennisons. Gretchen Dennison was the daughter of Martha and Arthur Sagendoff. She had 2 children, Patsy, who now lives in Pennsylvania, and Alan, a retired Air Force Master Sergeant. Mrs. Fortier and her son Edward lived in where the Gallants now live. She was the Mrs. Fortier from the electrical shop on Mechanic Street. DeWitt Tower, one of Spencer's industrialists, lived on the first floor of the next house going up the hill. Mr. Tower owned the Tower Box Company, manufacturers of shoe boxes. His factory was located in a building in the back of Clevin's. His daughter and son-in-law, Tom and Alice Duggan, and their son Dickie, occupied the second floor of the DeWitt Tower house. Tom Duggan was probably in his late 20s, but he was dying. A short time later, he passed away and left his widow and a young son. The next person going up the hill is Miss Mary Cruikshank. I won't read about her again, but if you remember, I had an essay about this wonderful lady out of the Victorian age a couple of segments ago. So I'm just going to go on, and we'll keep going so you can meet some of the other people on High Street. Let us continue along the street. The mansion that now belongs to Rick and Gail Lacaire belonged to a wealthy little widow by the name of Mrs. Prouty. I don't think she was related to Dick Prouty. If she was related, she was a distant relative. James and Grace Seymour and their 3 children occupied the cottage in the back of the Prouty mansion. The children were a little younger than I, Jane, Ann, and Peter. Mrs. Seymour was Mrs. Prouty's daughter. Incidentally, Mrs. Seymour, you've got to realize this was 1939, 63 years ago. Mrs. Seymour is still alive and quite well, living in Quabog Nursing Home in West Brookfield. But I believe she told me when I saw her not too long ago, she's 90 years old. The owner of the next house was Dr. Alonzo Amasa Bemis and his wife. Dr. Bemis was the great-uncle of Richard Bemis, owner of Bemis Nursery, and of course the great-great-uncle of Eddie Bemis. He was also very proud of being a direct descendant of Samuel Bemis, the first settler of Spencer. A few years later, he would be listed as the oldest practicing dentist in the United States. It was quite an experience to have him come to do some work in your mouth because he had Parkinson's disease. In his later years, his hand shook. The tenants on the second floor of the Bemis house was the manager of the Worcester County Trust Company, then situated on the southeastern corner of Main and Maple Street, and family Charlie Putnam and his wife, Evelyn, and two daughters, Connie, age 5, and Judy, age 2. The house across the street from ours was vacant, and it had been for a few years. It belonged to some people by the name of Wiggins who lived in, I believe, New York State or Pennsylvania. The house across the street from my house belonged to Harris and Louise Gray. The Grays had 2 children, Harris Jr. and his younger sister Shirley. Shirley did not live with her parents in Spencer. She lived with her maternal grandmother in Leominster. I'm going to pause for a minute. Many of you people remember Shirley as Shirley Brown. She now lives in Florida, but she used to live on Pleasant Street. I believe she was very active in the Spencer AARP and also very active in the Democratic Town Committee. Harris was much older than his wife, who taught dancing. A few years later, Louise Gray left Spencer with a male dance teacher by the name of Bill Jarvis, deserting her husband and 5-year-old son. She never again got in touch with her family. On the second floor of the house lived Mr. and Mrs. Raymond Hodgney and a son who was my age, Raymond. In the early 1940s, they moved to Pennsylvania. Next door, heading down the hill to Raymond Tower's house. Ray Tower, a brilliant Worcester Tech graduate, managed Tower Box Factory for his father, DeWitt Tower. During World War II, Ray would leave Spencer every night to go to a think tank to work on a secret project for the war. I've been told over the years one of the projects that he and also another former Spencer resident of many, many years ago, Murray Edinburgh, worked on was the gyroscope. The gyroscope, if anybody has ever been a tanker or served on a naval vessel, the idea of the gyroscope, if I'm correct, is to when you have a roll of a ship or a tank, that the sights seem to remain stationary. Ray Tower and his wife Olive were known to all the kids in the neighborhood as Uncle Raymond and Auntie Olive. Auntie Olive was also known by a couple generation of neighborhood kids as the Cookie Lady. She handed out cookies to the kids in the High Street neighborhood, I bet, for 30 years. Auntie Olive's elderly mother lived on the second floor of the house with her bachelor son. Flora Hazelhurst was a very pleasant little lady. Her son Harry was a shoe worker, very quiet and a loner. I do remember on hot summer nights sitting on our porch and hearing beautiful music from across the street as Harry sat by the upstairs window playing his violin. Where the Graves now live was the residence of Mr. and Mrs. Walter Sibley. Mr. Sibley worked for the L.D. Bemis Coal, Wood and Ice Company. In the winter, he delivered coal to heat Spencer homes, and in the summer, he delivered ice door to door. Remember that very few people had electric refrigerators. I'm now going to go back to Main Street and take you up High Street on the other side of the street. The house where the Cormiers live was not a house. It was an auto repair shop run by a man by the name of Leslie Hodgeny, who was killed in an automobile accident shortly after we moved to High Street in 1939. Jerome Cormier bought the garage and converted it to a house a few years later. The next house going up the hill belonged to a man by the name of Tebow. I don't remember too much about him. It seems to me that he was an executive in the shoe industry. The next house going up the hill belonged to Jack Baker, his wife Gertrude, and their son Sherman, who at that time was a student at Harvard University. Jack Baker was a very rich man, accumulating his wealth in the retail shoe business. People traveled from all over the East Coast to buy the reject shoes from Clevin's that were sold in a shop in the Clevin Shoe Building. J. Baker, as the business was called, were probably one of the first discount retailers in the country. Sherman Baker, Jack's son, was listed a few years ago by the Boston Globe as being one of the 100 wealthiest men in New England. He is still active in the shoe business, trading under many national names. Jack Baker, originally Goldstein, ran a pool room in Chelsea before meeting and marrying Gertrude Clevin, sister of Archie Clevin, a sharp young salesman from Boston who was employed by the Harris Shoe Company. Harris was Ernie Roberts' uncle. A few years after arriving in Spencer, Archie Clevin managed to buy the I.H. Prouty Boot and Shoe Company that was on the verge of bankruptcy. Clevin brought his sister Gertrude and his brother-in-law Jack Goldstein, now Baker, to Spencer. Gertrude was to be the office manager of Clevin Shoe, and Jack would work in the factory, being taught the skilled laster's trade. After a few years of working in the factory, Jack worked a deal with his brother-in-law to buy the reject shoes from the factory. The rest is history. Jack Baker was a drunk, a gambler, profane, but with a heart of gold. I believe that George Canoyer, the laundryman, owned the next house. He also owned the White Star Laundry. He went door to door picking up and doing people's wash, if they could afford a laundryman. George Canoyer was the brother of Dr. Romeo Canoyer. My mother at times used to use the services of the White Star Laundry until she purchased a round wringer-type washing machine. Dorothy and I also patronized the White Star Laundry when we first married. Ambrose and Irene Tower lived in the next house, now occupied by the Winingers. Ambrose Tower was an electrician and the brother of DeWitt Tower, owner of the Tower Box Company, Irene Tower used to spend hours on her porch, not missing a trick. She was the neighborhood gossip and busybody. The Towers had 2 grown children, Ambrose Jr., also an electrician, and a daughter, Marjorie. Marjorie married and later divorced a man originally from Maine by the name of Charlie Green, who made his living in Spencer as a wood chopper. Mr. Bolak, the Spencer tax collector, lived in the next house with his wife. I don't remember much about him except that he was already quite elderly back in 1939. The Spencer Broom shop on Lower Cherry Street, the largest manufacturer of corn brooms in the United States, belonged to a gentleman by the name of Leroy Latown. He either had built or purchased a cottage on the corner of Prouty Street for his aged mother. On the north corner of Prouty Street, on the first floor, was the home of Dr. Raymond McMurdo and his wife, Inez, and two sons, Raymond and Gordon. Raymond was my brother's age, with an unbelievable passion for trolley cars and trains. Raymond died about 2 years ago at the Masonic Home in Charlton. He was in his 70s and still talked about little else than trolleys. Gordon was a year older than me and was the leader of the High Street Kids. The second floor apartment was occupied by Sam and Ella Hyman and their only child, Marilyn. Marilyn, who you all know as Marilyn Budnick. I hope if she ever reads this story or hears this story now, she will not slug me for telling you this, but I remember her as a nice kid. But most of all, I was quite impressed with her hair, always fixed in baloney curls. The next house was ours. If you proceeded down the street, there was, of course, no Art and Linda White's home. There was just a large, vacant lot, overgrown and full of poison ivy. My mother and father sold the lot to a builder by the name of Huckins, in the 1950s. On the other side of the lot, we were fortunate enough to have the widow Emily Roberts and her two sons as our neighbors. Emily's whole life was wrapped up in her sons, Ernie, age 26, and the machinist